After the COVID-19, the healthcare is the most important topic globally, and this is the real issue. And we decided to host two of our very dear friends on a very important topic, reshaping the future of public healthcare. We have with us Douglas Corley, who is the founder, DHB Global, and CEO, Alaunius Technologies, and global partner, panel member, MIT Technology Review. Thank you and welcome, my friend Doug. And Doug visited Pakistan in our two conferences. He also visited for some business visit, and we are very dear friends. And he is also the member board of advisors of Nutshell Conferences Group. So he always is very supporting, very cooperative, and he's engaging and connecting us with the global healthcare players since last 2 years. So his colleague is Joy Wilson. He's another very good friend of mine, and we hosted him in Karachi last year. And Joy, thank you and welcome from Islamabad. And Joy is actually a scholar and consultant, EY-Parthenon, and global shaper, World Economic Forum as well. And they both of them actually will do this session together. And Douglas, as a senior, will lead this session. But before the starting of the session, I'm requesting my colleague Rabia Ahmed to introduce both of them. Rabia, over to you.
Hello and welcome to our session. It's very nice to be introduced to both of you. So first of all, let's introduce Douglas. Douglas is a Beijing-based healthcare entrepreneur with 7 years combined as a researcher in PRC's top biomedical labs and hospitals, and has been nominated to UNDP Greater China Innovation Council. He serves as digital health and biotech advisor and mentor for investment groups and NGOs. Douglas grew up in Omaha and was educated at Creighton University. After graduating in 2010 with a double degree in biomedical science and analytical philosophy, he moved to China to work on basic research in Beijing. He is also a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Shapers Community Expert Network, as well as a participant in their Precision Medicine Initiative. He is the CEO and founder of DHB Global, a biotech commercialization platform focused on bringing innovative healthcare solutions to their next stage of growth. He is also the CEO of Alaunius Technologies, a blockchain-powered health support platform that provides electronic health records and biomarker exchange to empower patients for the next generation of precision medicine. In his capacity as a community member with World Economic Forum, he has participated in roundtables bringing global healthcare leaders together in Beijing and built 2 global initiatives on health data and the future of precision medicine. He is currently engaged in co-authoring the first global healthcare data white paper with WEF experts. Now coming to Joey Wilson, he believes that 3 fields mainly impact our modern world: business, science, and policy. So he sought out educational and extracurricular experiences to gain exposure in all of these realms. Joey recently finished his MPhil in medical science at the University of Cambridge as a Cambridge International Scholar, where he conducted research on lung cancer and gained clinical perspectives. Prior to this, he was a Schwarzman Scholar at Tsinghua University in Beijing, China, where he studied global affairs with future global leaders from around the world. The Schwarzman Scholars Program curriculum integrates aspects of business, management, policy, and leadership through coursework and practical experience. The robust year-long degree is designed to prepare students for the challenges of the future.
And on a personal note, I want to share again that both of them are very dear friends and they are big supporters of Pakistan as well. And I'm grateful to both of you, Doug and Joy, for promoting Pakistan, for creating awareness about the opportunities in Pakistan, in healthcare and in other sectors as well. I know because you are engaging many international players with the Pakistani players. So I'm grateful to you on behalf of whole Pakistani nation. And over to you. And my only request to you is that the time for this combined session is 45 minutes. So in 45 minutes, both of you should complete your session. And over to you now, Doug.
Okay. Asfar and Rabia, thank you both so much for the flattering introduction. And Joey, thank you for joining. I'm really fortunate, just as a quick background, I had the great fortune of doing some mentoring while I was in Beijing. And Joey was, a very eager master student. And in fact, he reached out to me. And I was very impressed with, his intellect and also his curiosity to make a positive impact. And I'm very proud of where he is at this point. So very happy to be able to co-host this with him. I want to just give some high-level context. So perhaps, Rabia, I'm not sure who or how I can do a screen share. Let me try. Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you so much. So obviously, healthcare has changed in a nonlinear way over the past 18 or so months, both public, private, and elsewhere. If you can go to the next slide, please. And as we all know, vaccines seem to be at the center of the entire conversation. There's a lot more that we'll get into. I'll leave some of the details to Joey. He's a little bit more on the ground with those details. But from my aspect of the talk, I want you to think about not what a vaccine is or why it's important, but how interdependent every industry is right now with healthcare and how that will look moving forward. So it's obvious that business travel, I would love to be in Pakistan at the moment, but cannot for multiple reasons, one of them being just the logistics of business travel at the moment. You can see all of these currently that are affected, and many of these are near and dear to our hearts, whether they affect you directly or indirectly. The second thing that I'll say, just as a bit of a teaser, if I had to make a prediction about how public health is going to change their definitions, I would say it's no longer completely separating climate change from healthcare. I think the reality today is that these two are interconnected and interdependent. We just don't know how to define it properly. We will. That will take time. So with that, Joey, I'd love to toss it over to you. I think the more interesting part for everyone in attendance is for us to be able to get to our discussion. So please take it away.
Exactly. So next slide, please. Yeah, so first I'll say Doug hit already on some really interesting trends, which we'll talk more about. But one thing to contextualize what Doug just said as a transition is, I think this is the first time in modern history where we've seen the juxtaposition so clearly of science and society. Of course, in the past, as Nick so well put it in his last talk, we've evolved with technologies over time, but they haven't really been at the forefront. They've been things we've adopted and used, but we haven't thought about how they came to be. And now with vaccine development and the COVID crisis, science is at the forefront, and we're seeing the scientific method play out in real time. And I think that is something that we cannot underestimate the impact of in the long term. But as Doug said, I'm a bit more on the ground in terms of technology when it comes to the vaccines. And something I talked about last time I was in Karachi was the mRNA-based vaccine candidates. And back then, almost a year ago, I predicted that these would become approved very quickly and that these would also have one of the largest impacts. And in the past year, names like Mrna and BioNTech/Pfizer have become household. Whereas, once again, in the past, nobody really knew so much about this industry. And why are these candidates so exciting? Just to go through it again, they're cheaper to develop and produce. They're faster to develop and produce. They're safer, which means at the end of the day, they're not going to impact your genome directly, which is something people are worried about with these vaccines. And we'll talk a bit about conspiracies later. It's uncertain still, but it seems that these vaccines are more effective, but more research needs to be done on those in the long term. And ultimately, what we're talking about here is the future, and they're really exciting. So all of these things are super relevant in terms of these mRNA-based candidates. And these themselves aren't only vaccines. the technology isn't only about COVID. The technology has been under development for over a decade and just hasn't gotten traction until now. And now that the traction is there, I think you'll see some of these therapeutics coming out for cancer, for example, or countless other rare diseases, and really be impactful. And we can go to the next slide. But in the meantime, while we're transitioning to this, I would say, you know, this is something that will really impact the next decade and really our lifetime, because the way that these therapies slot in with other data and innovations that are being created today really creates a very powerful environment. But yes, next slide, please. Great. So just briefly, also last time we discussed 3 Ps of the future of medicine: precision, predictive modeling, personalization. But actually now I would add a 4th P, which is participation. In the future, I think with all the data that we're being informed by, people will also be able to be a bigger actor in their own healthcare and also be empowered to do so with the data that they have. So, you know, in the past, people have had maybe some bad or malformed habits, but now they're so much easier to recognize. It's so much easier to be motivated, get off the couch and have a healthy lifestyle. But in terms of these P's, something else to think about and kind of contextualizing our conversation is the impact of genetic sequencing, which we're all familiar with. It's come on the frame very quickly in the past decade, and now I'd say that's almost ubiquitous. And in fact, all of these things are digital health and health data, which Nick also talked about with blockchain. And I know Doug is very familiar with that topic. I think super interesting. And then lastly, cell and gene therapies, which in fact, mRNA-based therapies fall into this category more broadly, even though of course they don't directly impact the genome. But point being here, there are so many novel technologies that are really disease specific that don't treat the symptoms, they actually cure the cause of the disease. And as these become researched and approved, they're going to transform the way we approach public health, because instead of treating chronic symptoms over a lifetime and people being unable to live, you know, their full life necessarily, they'll be cured of these diseases and be able to continue life as it was. So, you know, something to contextualize the conversation. But now, you know, in thinking about the future, we also really have to understand the present, and that's where I'm going to throw it back to you, Doug.
Sure. If we can stay on this slide just for a moment, Joy, just to contextualize, there are many autoimmune or inflammatory diseases that are fairly common, even though they're categorized as rare diseases. And so let's say that you have a form of arthritis or something to this effect. If you had that diagnosis 10 to 20 years ago, you would have been very much in a rough place. You would have had a lot of the signs and symptoms that would develop over time. Your outcome would not be terribly ideal. And the best therapeutic that they could give you had some strong drawbacks. It may cause kidney issues because of the strength of the medicine and because it was not targeted. Fast forward to today, and you have very targeted injections, or what are called biologics, that can treat the root cause of the issue and eliminate symptoms. So in the past, you used to be able to go to minimizing some of the symptoms, but not the underlying cause. Now we're at a point where you can begin to minimize the cause, but you're not yet eliminating the root cause. It's still there. Let's say it is a button that is pushed on all the time. Well, you can make sure that everything that comes after that button is pushed doesn't happen, but that button is still pushed. And what some of these cell and gene therapies will do is actually go and change that button, so it's no longer turned on, so you don't have those negative effects anymore. And that's really where I'm very excited, because you know, in a multitude of ways, COVID has shown that the policy framework around R&D and clinical trialing medicines can be a lot faster. But I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. If we can have the next slide, please. And I'm going to have to squint at the screen. Sorry, next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm sure that all of us want lots of statistical updates about exactly how many this, that, and the others have happened today. So I'll keep it brief. I thought it would be very important for us to understand, as we discuss public health, where we are, so that we can understand potentially where we're going. So as of this morning, 184 countries have given 6.03 billion doses, approximately 31.5 million doses per diem, which is quite impressive. Enough now that 39.2% of the global population is vaccinated. That's good. The problem is it's very lopsided. The fourth line here, the least wealthy 52 countries have 20% of the world's population and less than 4% of the world's vaccines. At this pace, assuming that we don't have any new wild variants named after new Greek alphabet letters, it'll take 6 months to cover 75% of the population, and that's simply not good enough.
And Doug, just to step in here a little bit, we've seen in some of the most wealthy countries now that booster doses have been approved for people, and I believe that this pace assumes that vaccines are more equally distributed, and that people aren't getting third doses, for example. Of course, scientifically, doses like booster doses make sense, but in my opinion, it's probably more important to vaccinate the rest of the world at first, and that would be another barrier we foresee. I think Doug maybe has some more information, but recently there have been a lot of articles published stating the actual cost, and from an economic standpoint, not only a social standpoint, with this vaccine inequity, and it's trillions of dollars. This is a big issue.
Yeah, so to delve on that, a couple of important points. The World Health Organization Chief Scientific Officer has not yet officially approved the use of boosters. As one clear data point, not to say that a third dose doesn't make sense scientifically or medically, but yes, the last statistic, and I can't share the actual files, otherwise I would have included them. It was in a Chatham House rules presentation, but what I can share is that there's a lot of intelligence gathering amongst various governments and various high-level business organizations, and between COVID's beginning and 2025, it's predicted that there will be over 5.8 trillion, with a T, US dollars lost in economic opportunity. And unfortunately, Middle East and ASEAN, or Southeast Asia, are the most heavily hit. So that's actually where I am at the moment. I am normally based in Beijing. I have a home there, but I came to Thailand right before COVID, January of 2020, and my favorite phrase for my situation is I'm a COVID refugee. I couldn't have chosen many better places to be, but when you see the economic issues that have come about because of this, it gives you pause to appreciate what you have. If you don't mind, can we have the next slide? Okay. So Joey, this is where I think the bulk of the conversation is. You're American, as am I. I can see the football jerseys behind you. So where you are, what's happening? Maybe you can give a little bit of context.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. To give a little context, Doug said now he's in Thailand, and I'd say Doug is, one of the world-renowned experts in terms of Asia right now in this sphere. I'm American as well, but currently living in Munich, Germany. So have seen a lot of how, different policies have gone on the ground and in practice. I'd say here in Europe, there have been a lot of diverse policies. Some countries have gone the approach of really just ignoring COVID in the first part. You may remember Sweden. And that was one path that it seems hasn't played out very well. There are other countries who were very, very cautious, Germany being one of those, living here, being under lockdown very frequently, not being able to go to restaurants or be outside after a certain time. Pretty strict measures, but at the end of the day, as it's played out, it seems that countries that were maybe more cautious in the beginning now are able to open up quicker and more safely, at least from my perspective. But, the thing about public health that I mentioned before is, and that Doug also mentioned, is it's really coming together with a lot of other realms where maybe we haven't recognized it as such previously. Doug mentioned climate change, which is an important thing, but also you have to remember that public health is also heavily political. And where we are in Germany now, also in the United States last year, it was now here in Germany, and last year in the US, it was an election year. And that definitely plays a role in the policies that are created. And unfortunately, science doesn't always influence policy directly. And if there's anything I've learned in my last years studying both hard science and kind of global affairs, it's, at times maybe for different reasons, some of them good even, science doesn't inform policy directly. It's informed by a milieu of other factors. And I think that's something that contextualizes our conversation. So when we talk about situations in different countries and the way things have developed, you can't only look at the thing itself. You have to understand the context because it's very relevant. And for that reason, what works in Germany might not work in the US. What works in the US may not work in Pakistan. But still, you can identify best practices.
So at this point, Joey, what I can think of as general policy approaches would be maybe at least two. One would be a zero COVID policy framework, where I think New Zealand famously has taken this approach, and President Jacinda, whenever a case pops up, they literally lock down. And I think to some degree the Philippines has taken a similar approach. Fun fact, the Philippines has been under a pretty excruciating 18-month consecutive lockdown.
Yep.
There are a few other types of approaches, and I think you being on the ground in Europe, you may be able to help people understand what those look like. So a zero COVID approach, what are some of the other approaches you've seen?
Yeah, so there's zero COVID as in don't want any cases. And as you mentioned, there are countries that have done that. In Europe, I don't think we've seen that as much. I'd say Germany skews in that direction, but, certainly not as far as New Zealand or the Philippines. There were definitely highs and lows, or peaks and troughs. But on the other opposite, I mentioned a country like Sweden, which has changed their policies. But if I recall, last year they just initially said, we're not going to have any restrictions. We're going to keep going with this. It's like the flu, and we're going to see how bad it is. And the answer was it was bad. So instead of a zero COVID policy, it was almost like a COVID doesn't exist policy on the other extreme, which I don't think worked either. And then I'd say in Europe, we've seen varying degrees of, between those. That's the best way I can explain it. Like, you had countries very heavily impacted, like Italy and Spain for a while, for example. And it's not that people didn't take it seriously. It's that kind of policies were implemented, I guess, too late, unfortunately.
Sure. So this gives us a good context to think a little bit about maybe some of the personal stories that we've come across, and some of the things that affect us day to day, whether it's media or news or misinformation, or as a good friend of mine called it, disinformation. I think a lot about this. I have a very, very well-educated sibling who, while he understands that, mRNA vaccines, for example, may work, is hesitant to, for himself or his family, use something like this. So, maybe we'll start high level. What are some of the other, maybe not conspiratorial, but what are some of the other issues that you seem to hear or come across? And then maybe we can look at discussing those a little bit more in depth.
Yeah, for sure. Doug, as was mentioned before, is from Nebraska. I'm from South Carolina in the U.S., and if you're not familiar with the areas, a lot of times it's more rural, and people maybe have different priorities or look at situations very differently. So where I'm from, I have dialogue with people all the time. I actually myself put my information on Facebook and wrote a bit about, my scientific view of the vaccines and invited people to call me and have dialogue if they had concerns or wanted to talk about it. And I had probably tens of people call me and share things they'd found online. And many of these things were, alarming to me. And the problem was with a lot of these things that they weren't necessarily incorrect. The context was wrong. And one example I would say is one thing that was forwarded to me was that in the trials of the vaccines, there were events where people had bad diseases that happened to them after the vaccine was administered. And out of context, that looks really bad. But in context, noting the societal level of these things happening on a normal basis, these were not abnormal events. These are things that happen to regular people. And,
regardless of the vaccination.
Regardless of the vaccination, exactly. So I think the real danger here, which Doug pointed to before, was not necessarily misinformation, which in this case I would argue maybe it is, but disinformation, where there are things that are true in a sense but not contextualized and thus are scary. That's another thing I learned in grad school, that numbers without context can be used in any direction. And in fact, that's what I think we've seen happening a lot is unfortunate disinformation mainly spreading online. And I think that's where people's reservations come from, or, many of them.
Sure, if I can jump in so my goldfish memory doesn't betray me. I would say yes, that's all right, but one of the issues that I hear quite often, and the part of South Carolina that you're from, Duncan, is a little bit more rural than my hometown. I'm from technically the 49th largest city in America. If you look at the greater metro area, we have roughly 1 million people. It's kind of a lie. It's more like 500,000. But if you amalgamate, anyway, so there are some reasonably well-educated people who have gone and lived overseas, traveled overseas, and think just beyond their border. And yet, I think this encapsulates one of the issues that is relevant for public health today and in the future, and that is, what is the correct voice of an expert? And Joey, as you were explaining things, I thought about one of our fellow shapers. His name is Dr. Eric Feigl-Deng, Feigl-Deng. And if you don't know who he is, his words, not mine, he is the Asian guy that goes on and talks about vaccines. He's a fantastic human being. He believes in service and serving the community. He's also a Harvard-trained epidemiologist, which means he studies public health and the data. He's a professor currently at Harvard, and he also is a policy expert at the Brookings Institution. And yet, because of political leanings, he's viewed as a Democrat, or stripping away political parties. He's viewed as an expert in his ivory tower, and that creates distrust in some public bases. And I think that's at the core of it, stripping away country, societal differences. I think that's it. How can we have better dialogues between experts and non-experts? How can we help people understand in a way that how can we make it more palatable?
Yeah, that's definitely true, and something I've seen as well. And it's also tough when you have people who are doctors or nurses who are against the vaccine too, because for a regular person now, especially with social media, sometimes I guess it's hard to know who to believe. And also a lot of educated people do their own research. And, online, it's easy to find a lot of information. But, I think, as you said, Doug, it's really a bad idea to say people are high up in the ivory tower and ignore their expert opinion, because, I'm going to trust a doctor like Eric that you mentioned, personally, probably more than Facebook. But sometimes it's hard to see where the line is or who to trust if you don't have a trusted resource. So yes, I think the dialogue is very important, and that's something that there needs to be more room for, including in making policy.
Yeah, and to make this full circle, it really comes back to what you introduced as sort of the fourth P, right? Making sure that medicine or public health is participatory, right? So it's predictive, preventative, personalized, participatory. People's voices need to be understood if they're going to follow orders. I think gone are the days of people, doing what they're told, and I think that's a great thing. I think society moves forward faster and better when people have their own voice heard. But it comes with a huge responsibility. So I think we're still trying to figure out how best to do that. And I think a great example of this, Joey, might be, as the previous speaker was identifying, a lot of the technologies today, like social media, we're starting to see a breakdown almost of the business model or of the contract between user and platform. And I think that is a good meta-narrative for what's happening everywhere. COVID has changed the way the dialogues happen. There's now a lot more information out there. Our brains can't understand it. Joey, what do you think with regard to the way in which some of this information is shared? And you've done a degree in policy, and this is an area of extreme passion for you. Not to maybe get prescriptive, but what have you seen as best practices?
In terms of information sharing, you mean?
Information sharing, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think data is a huge topic in health, and, in the future, personal data is going to become ubiquitous. As I said last time I was in Pakistan, we have so much data about ourselves and about others, and the question is, how can we responsibly use that data and also protect the individual? Because a lot of this data, if used well, could completely transform healthcare and enable better care provision for everybody everywhere. But if put in the wrong hands, there could be all kinds of negative consequences, dystopian consequences that we all know. So sorry to interrupt. Let's see if we can merge a couple of things together and see if we can walk through a hypothetical example, right? So the idea of next-gen technologies. So you have multi-omic medicine and healthcare data. Let's say it's stored on a blockchain. The average, mom and pop don't care about the difference between a proteome and a genome. How might you, to put you on the spot, how might you have that dialogue with them in a way that's going to help them not be more compliant, but better understand why participation can help? Sure. Well, in this, it's kind of a help yourself, help everybody scenario, which, you could also argue is true with vaccines, right? At the end of the day, I think people are going to have to value what they get and realize that what they get is a function of what other people give. And if you turn that around, then it should say ethically and morally, well, since I'm getting so much from this, I should also give. And in this respect, I don't think everybody needs to understand all of their omic data. There's just so much stuff out there. Even you and I maybe don't completely understand all of those aspects because they're so niche.
I was about to say, yeah, and it's changing, as was said, it changes literally every month. There's some new massive paper that says, okay, RNA is now able to be used in this separate way.
Exactly. And that's actually the problem I witnessed in academia a lot, was that there are all these really interesting research projects ongoing, but when scientists are talking to people, they assume that the most important group are other scientists. But in fact, I would argue that the most important people that scientists talk to are policymakers, business people, and even more importantly, the general public, and understanding why the science is important, which is exactly what you're saying. So I wouldn't go to somebody and say, we're taking all these things so we can understand your proteome. I would start with why, kind of like Simon Sinek says, right? And say, at the end of the day, all of the information we're collecting informs everybody else about not only you, but on a meta level, what happens to people like you. And there are many people like you out there. And by understanding the people like you, you can get better care, because whatever's tried somewhere else, good or bad, could then be applied as a learning for you. And you see that in Tesla as well, just to add another technology. You see that.
One of the approaches that's been used, American in the room, so I don't know if it's been popular in other parts of Middle East, but in the US, they were actually paying people, right? So there was a direct financial incentive. As all of these things require participation, I'm just not sure, what is the best way? Do you think that incentives should play a role?
Yeah, I mean, incentives from the start will certainly help people to elect to do this. I mean, in the beginning, I think you have to have incentives. And there are interesting platforms that kind of align incentives as well. There are companies out there that, for example, now you can get your genome analyzed and then sell the data on their platform and make money at the end of the day. But I think incentives are important to get people to understand what they're contributing to, but at the end of the day, it can't be the main driver. Just like giving blood. Most people, at least in the US, I can't speak to other places, give blood for the greater good. Yes, you might get movie tickets or whatever, but in the end, people see it as a way they can help others and feel rewarded. So I think we should create a societal pressure in this area as well. Of course, not in a dystopian sense, but I mean, I would hope that if everyone were able at a base level to understand the value of this information and the contribution to public health that it would make, that many people would elect to do it anyway. Or, that the channel would be so easy for them to elect to do it that they wouldn't think otherwise.
Yeah,
but
I'll give an example from my personal life. Having lived in China for as long as I did, roughly 10 years, when I worked in research and when I worked in hospitals, it was essentially mandatory. They would expect that you'd be making a donation on, I think it was every 3 months, that you were able to do, unless you had a medical condition. And it was very much so that they could make sure that the hospital was able to operate, or the research facility employees would have access to the blood types that were required. And it really was this sense of community. You do have a responsibility to your community. So I don't want to belabor the point too much. I think it would be good for us to move into both what's needed and, as we do that, we can identify a few predictions. So Joey, from where we are to where we're going, what do you think is needed?
Yeah, I think we need to take the momentum that we've given to science in terms of the public eye and build up trust, not only in science itself, but the pharmaceutical industry and all of these greater drivers that at the end of the day really are doing their best to contribute to the greater good. I don't think we can be so cynical about it. So one thing is, yes, more trust in science and more backing in science by society. I think that's needed. Practically, more people have to get vaccinated and take precautions. There's the line debated in the U.S. between personal freedoms and protecting others. But I'm hopeful that people will make the choice to get vaccinated and wear masks and do those things. And then practically, as we move forward, it might just end up being in a scenario that we have to accept COVID as part of our daily life and be able to minimize the risk while understanding that it's still going to be there. My prediction would be that COVID's not going away anytime soon, unfortunately. Diseases just don't get eradicated and go away without a lot of work. So maybe this becomes more like the flu, not necessarily in terms of what it is, but how it's dealt with yearly boosters, et cetera. But, we're gonna have to transition to that at some point once the main battle has been fought. But I guess the analogy I'm trying to make is, at some point we're gonna win this battle, but it's gonna be a war. So it's gonna stick with us for a while, and we're gonna have to be smart about it. But I do believe that the new normal will be close to the old normal at some point.
Now, I would say what's needed is we need better acceptance of what technologies are currently available, and give a little bit more of a charitable expectation One, for why they're here, why they're being used, and two, what the risks are. Now, I think the scientific community needs to bear a lot of the responsibility. Just to, Joey, one thing that you've always described yourself as is, not to put words in your mouth, but essentially a science communicator.
That's
trying
right.
to take complex ideas and make it very, simple. And I think you do that quite well. It's something that I strive for every day as well. And it's very important that the technologies that we have and the technologies that are being used, whether it's vaccination, whether it's testing, whether it's some of the therapeutics that are already in place for COVID. And unfortunately, as research comes out for things like long COVID and some of the complications that we have, there will be therapeutics for this. There will be treatments for this. There will be better ways of managing chronic disease, which is unfortunate. There's also the entire business application to this, which is relevant to public health. So bear with me. For large amounts of medical manufacturing moving forward, you're going to be required, I believe it's by 2023, to have a viral decontamination process in place. And it's going to be specifically because of COVID-19 particles, but it's going to be for other things as well. And as one of our scientific advisors, Dr. Michael Osterholm, explained, and Bill Gates is very commonly explained as Farhad pointed out, we're clearly entering a phase where you'll go from pandemic to endemic, post-pandemic, and then unfortunately, potentially, starting the cycle all over again, which means we need to learn our lessons from the pandemic that we're still in so that we transition into endemic better. And that can, it's going to be cultural. That can mean, as people are looking to travel for religious events, that they need to be more better protected. Maybe they need to get specific vaccinations. Maybe they need to avoid certain kinds of environments. Governments can then work with them to make sure that, as people, whether it's traveling home or it's traveling to a destination event, that people are safe. And as you move into endemic, Joey, just as you said, business travel will resume, leisure travel will resume, and we'll get back to having a normal life. But we may have things as we look around. You close your eyes and you look around the room and your environment. It's going to look a little bit different. There might be something that sprays as you walk through the gates at the airport instead of it just being metal check, just to make sure, just to be safe. And small adjustments like this, I think that, we will be numb to. And I don't say that in a pessimistic way. I think that we'll need to do this because biology and science as a story, we're always playing catch up. Science, no matter how smart we are, biology is kind of, a priori, to use a philosophical term. It came before. So every time that there's a problem, you can then address it with a solution. If you don't know what the problem is, you can't address the solution. So I think there needs to be, Joy, you said it very well, maybe better understanding of the scientific principles or and that logic, or just, better faith that, big evil corporations aren't there just to take over the world. They may actually have a function. So,
yeah, Doug, I think all of that is really great, and I think you're right. I think a lot of these things will be adopted in daily life. But one thing that I'd hit on briefly before we end about a prediction for the future in public health is something that people assume all the time is that the more sanitation, the better. And we're in this instance now where antibiotics are causing a lot of problems. And even things like hand sanitizer, believe it or not, also at the end of the day could cause problems. So I'm not here saying don't be sanitary, but the influence of the microbiome, to refer to another omic, is so interesting. And that's a topic I hope next year when you and I are in Islamabad, hopefully in person with everybody, reflecting on the past couple years, I hope we can talk more about, because the microbiome is one of those things where it's not only every month, maybe it's every week, we're learning more about how important that is. So maybe as a foray into our next time in Pakistan, microbiome is going to be influencing the future along with everything we discussed today. But Doug, if you don't have any other closing comments, should we take questions, or do you have a little thing to add?
No, I'll just end with a really, really terrible science joke, which is trust your guts. And then I'd love to have any questions from the audience.
Yes, so thank you, Douglas and Joy, for your wisdom and very informative session for everyone. And what are your specific recommendations for Pakistan in the current scenario?
Yeah, so if I had to...
Pakistan, and you know Pakistan market very well. So what are your specific recommendations? This is the main question from one of the participants.
Sure. So, Joey, I'll address it first if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay. I'm hesitant to make prescriptive recommendations, but what I would say is make sure that vaccination happens at the rates that are required. I think it's very important that vaccines are brought in and that it's done with transparency. I know that it's very diplomatic, and it also leads to a lot of questions from public. So I'd say, number one, be very transparent with how vaccines are coming. Thailand, for example, has had a lot of headaches because they said they were coming, but they weren't. And then the reason they weren't coming was negotiations had failed, and there were a lot of issues around that. So I would say number one is make sure the vaccination rates get to where they need to be. Number two, I would say make sure that there are easy, accessible options for tests. There are saliva options, there are breathing, respiratory options, and there's, as we all know, the nasopharyngeal swab option. So I think making sure that people, if you're going to have a small social gathering, that people can feel comfortable knowing that they're safe, knowing that, yesterday I was out, today I'm still COVID-free, I'm not going to infect anyone. And the last thing I would say is, as Joey and I were saying, I think it's very important that there's a sincere conversation about how the economy is going to come back. I think Pakistan has an amazing opportunity ahead of it, as I've told you in person. And I think some of the technologies I mentioned, where, whether it is some of the technologies around currently slowing the issues around COVID, and in the medium term, some of the manufacturing that is going to require change. There's a huge amount to talk about there. The big one that I'd point to is, again, how do industrial manufacturers respond to COVID? And there's an entire large section of manufacturing that's going to need to change their ways. Joey, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, just to add, I would say anecdotally from my experience, the test aspect is super important. In Germany, they covered all of the tests for the past year, and now slowly they're weaning off of PCR because of the cost, but still rapid antigen tests are available. And really, whether you're vaccinated or not at this point, because of the rate of breakthrough infection, I think it's important that people utilize those. Like a friend of mine recently had an experience where his girlfriend who was vaccinated had COVID, but they caught it really early and were able, they believe, not to spread it. And that's really important for us to personally do. And then secondly, to hit on Doug's last point, I think Doug and I both have visited Pakistan and seen the great pharmaceutical industry. And I think of course, this is a hard time, but it's also a time of opportunity to build capacity and make a real impact. That's more of an industry standpoint, but I strongly believe in Pakistan's pharmaceutical industry. Lots of great companies there, many of which we've interacted with. And yeah, I think there are many ways that they can make an impact in the short and medium term that also leads them in the long term to be very big players, not only in the local market, but also in the regional and even global market.
Yeah. And one detail as far that I'll add with regard to testing. As we all know, the original test was just plus or minus. You have COVID, you do not. What we have now is kind of a next generation test where it will actually tell you the sort of variant that you have. Now, our therapeutics aren't yet able to match that particular variant, but they will. Give it 6 to 12 months. So I think it would be very important for policymakers. These things need to be reviewed before they can be allowed into the markets. And the companies in Pakistan need to have partnerships and or local manufacturing, as Joey was alluding, opportunities to be able to have these available and accessible for people. So those would be my recommendations.
And then the last thing I would say with the testing is ensuring that there's genetic analysis as well, as Doug has alluded to, because the tracking of variants nowadays is super important, not only for the local, but also global. So yeah, if Pakistan can improve its track and trace capabilities, then that also helps not only for this pandemic, but as Doug alluded to whatever the next pandemic eventually may be.
Very important recommendations you shared, and you mentioned about the pharmaceutical industry, and one of the best pharmaceutical company in Pakistan is Martin Group, and they own Merck Marker in Pakistan and Roche as well. Both of you already met their leadership, and they are the co-hosts of this Leaders in Islamabad Business Summit. We initiated together the summit 4 years back. And my final question to you is that what about the public-private partnership scenario in Pakistan, in the healthcare infrastructure? What are your recommendations in this specific area? What government and the private sector should do for public-private partnership?
Yeah, I think, Joey, do you want to, if you have any thoughts, I'm happy for you to go first.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the relationship between government and industry, I think it has to remain strong. It seems like that there are a lot of opportunities to come together nowadays and really have an impact. I mean, I'm not sure specifically what the needs are, but in the space, public-private partnership is such an important vehicle to make an impact. So whether it's building up some of the capabilities and there's help needed there, or even creating separate entities that can do some of the research in the near term for some of these technologies. I mean, I think the first aspect of this would be understanding exactly where the opportunity lies. Like, for example, one aspect could be fill and finish capabilities for some of the industry. But, I think it really depends on an in-depth analysis. But I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Doug?
So as far, I would say it's very important that you look at what's worked globally. And I failed to mention much about China, despite me being kind of a China hand with regard to COVID response. So I can give a perspective on how China has handled their PPPs, public-private partnerships. And I think China has a really good roadmap or checklist for success. I think what they've done very well is they've cut through a lot of red tape. They allow foreign companies to come in and have full ownership with tax benefits and investments on the ground. It gives them preferential access for top talents through local universities and access to facilities for manufacturing. And I think the other big area for more regulated industries, because that's typically where public-private partnerships become very tricky. If you're in heavy real estate investments, large capex type transactions, or you're in heavy industry, or you're in healthcare. I think it's very important that the regulatory bodies give clear feedback on what's required, what is accessible, and what is not. And again, where China, I would point to two areas where China has a unique thought process, and that is an area called Hainan, where you're able to do a large amount of clinical trialing and a large amount of R&D, and actually get direct feedback.
Thank you. Thank you. Over to you, Rabia.
Thank you, Asfa.
Well, thank you very much. This was a very informative session, and thank you for taking out time. Hopefully, the next time we have this summit, you will join us physically in Pakistan. So thank you.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Inshallah.
Looking forward to it. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you, and
greetings.
and see you all soon.
See you soon.
See you soon.
And continue your support for Pakistan.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.